Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Step 1 in the act of deepest cruelty is to deny the humanity of the one you're being cruel toward. This is what animates the worst of our racism. This is what pushed and allowed the Nazis to commit their atrocities against Jewish people. This is what allows the wanton destruction of the unborn in our own nation to continue now 40-some years after it began. We deny the humanity of the ones we're cruel to. But there is another group of people who we are often cruel toward, having denied them their humanity, that we don't often think of as being victimized, which may be one of the reasons why we're so guilty. The people that we so easily dehumanize are the famous. It doesn't matter how or why they're famous. Just the fact that they're famous seems to somehow put it in our minds that they're no longer needful of the blessings of being treated humanely. If we disagree with someone politically who has their own talk show or is otherwise well known, we can speak in humiliating, dehumanizing ways about them. We can hurl accusations at them with no evidence whatsoever, thinking it doesn't matter because they're not human. I began to think about this again. It's not the first time, but I began to think about this again recently when Jerry Falwell Jr. Found himself back in the news after a photo of him and his wife's assistant was published by him on his Instagram account that was, to say the least, troubling and puzzling. Not the kind of thing that a person ought to post, much less the kind of picture should someone take, nor circumstances someone should be in. Now, unless you think worse than it was, this is not. I don't know how to put it. There's nothing sexual going on at the moment. Okay, so he puts this thing up, and this hubbub arises, and the fruit of it is that Jerry Falwell Jr. is now on an indefinite leave of absence as the president of Liberty University. And I watched not just unbelievers who hate him because, as the president of Liberty University and the son of Jerry Falwell, he is one of those evil fundamentalists that needs to be mocked. I watch Christians do the exact same thing. By the way, I've done it too. If I've disagreed with a well-known theologian, pastor, writer, apologist, I've been quite comfortable not treating them with dignity and respect. One of the blessings that comes from actually knowing some of these people is that you know that they're people. It doesn't mean that we don't call out bad doctrine. It doesn't mean that those in positions to do so don't deal with bad behavior. And that's the thing. I don't know what, if anything, should be done about this picture with Jerry Falwell Jr., but why would I? Why would I have an opinion on it? Why would I get a vote in the matter? He has a board of directors over him with respect to his job. He has a group of elders over him in his church. What in the world does that have to do with me? I had a friend, very dear friend, very, very well known in that subsection of the evangelical church that's committed to homeschooling, who was caught up in a scandal. And he published a confession, and that confession some people believed was insufficiently clear, insufficiently open, and he published a clarification, and then other accusations were bandied about, and people wanted more answers, and some of them came to me. What do you think? What do you know? What's the scoop? What's the dope? I said, this is what I know. I know that he's guilty of A, B, C, and D, and these are serious things. Well, how do you know he's guilty of those things? Oh, because of his letter. Because he said he was. Everything else that's been said, I have no way of knowing. How would I? I wasn't there. So I'm not going to convict him of it. I'm not going to guess whether these other things may have happened or not. I have no reason to. Friends, those people are people. Whether it's secular people or Christian people. Whether it's people on your side of the aisle or people on the other side of the aisle. They're people. And the one who redeems us calls us to treat them with dignity and respect. We come now to our first segment on the 9th commandment, where the Lord God, speaking to his own people as they're about to enter into the promised land, commands of them that they should not bear false witness against their neighbor. Now, I, again, have no quarrel with the wisdom of summarizing or reducing down God's commands to something perhaps a smidge easier to remember, so long as we remember that when we do so, we're missing something. That is to say, if you take this commandment and reduce it down to don't lie, you are missing some nuance in the command. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. And so, again, if the goal is to help little kids remember, don't lie. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's more to it than that. Now, some of you may remember that for the last semester or 3, I have been blessed to have the opportunity to teach philosophy at the local community college. And included in that has been teaching a class on ethics. And one of the first assignments that I've given to my students is to write a brief essay on whether or not it's ever justifiable to lie. And it's been interesting to me to watch these students give their answers because, to their credit, they're honest enough to acknowledge that they're not always honest. And so virtually every single paper that I have received has been principally an attempt at justifying what we call white lies. And for this segment, I want to start there, and we'll have more to talk about in this command next time. But let's start with these white lies. And what I say to these students is this. And keep in mind that I'm taking a very stone in the shoe approach to these students. If you remember, we covered the stone in the shoe in an earlier segment, talking about how in our apologetic efforts, it may not be the best thing all the time to try to race to the close, but you want to put a stone in the people's shoes so that as they're walking along, you're giving them something to think about, something that they can't quite get rid of. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do. And so the way I will do that in this context is to get them to think, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. You need to realize that there's a cost to be paid here. Typically, they'll give me that kind of example where their friend says, do I look good in this dress? Or how does the pie that I baked taste? And how, or even with children and things like Santa Claus. That these are all examples where we're telling untruths, and it's all for the good. And I tell them, look, I'm not arguing that, for instance, it might not hurt your friend's feelings if you don't like her dress or don't like the pie. I'm not arguing that there aren't kinds of joy and delight that come from believing in Santa Claus. But don't miss the other part of the equation. Because what you have to understand is every time you tell a little white lie, you diminish the capacity to tell the truth. If I really, really, really want to know if the pie I baked is any good, and I have to worry that everybody I ask is going to be so concerned about my hurt feelings that they're not going to tell me the truth, I'm going to get in a bad way. There's one of the all-time great episodes of the Andy Griffith Show runs along those lines as Barney and Opie and Andy find themselves having to choke down 1 million of Aunt Bee's kerosene pickles because they don't have the heart to tell her how terrible they are. Well, it gets worse. I tell the kids, I remember precisely where I was. I remember where I was in the car. I remember what road the car was on. I remember what spot the car was on the road. I remember where everybody else was in the road. I was 7 years old. I remember when I found out there was no Santa Claus. And one of the reasons that I remember where everybody was in the car is because the one person told me, and I looked and I asked my mom. And she, at that point, told me the truth. And it wasn't shattering to me that there was no Santa Claus. It was shattering to me that my parents had lied to me. There's a reason that we're called to be a people of the truth. For one thing, we are on the side of the one who is truth. We're on the side of the one who's never spoken an untruth. But another reason is this: every untruth we tell breaks down the foundation of truth itself. Do not bear false witness in truth is not the same thing as do not tell a lie, but they're related. And we'll consider this again, God willing, next time. There are precious few people who are very good at everything. And there are precious few writers who are very good at every kind of writing. As much as I admire G.K. Chesterton and consider him to be one of the greatest writers ever, I'm not much of a fan of his poetry. I can read his short stories, I can read his novels, I can read his essays, I can read his monographs, all of these things. I'm happy to do so. Poetry, not so much. C.S. Lewis, I can read his fiction, I can read his nonfiction, I can read his long works, I can read his short works, I can read his essays. His book on Renaissance literature, not so much. Well, I mention all of this because one of the great writers of the 20th century of fiction in our country was the great John Steinbeck. When I was first being introduced to the blessings of reading serious fiction in junior high school, we got to read The Pearl. That was my introduction to Steinbeck. I'm a huge fan of Mice and Men. And yet there are other writers of outstanding fiction whose nonfiction I'm non-interested in. So imagine my surprise when I was perusing my father's library, which was not at all unusual, when I was in high school at this point, and I'm in his office and I'm just sort of spinning around in a circle looking at all the books on the shelves, and I came across a John Steinbeck work that's nonfiction. The book is called Travels with Charley, and it is the subject of this Curating Your Book Library segment. It is a nonfiction account written by John Steinbeck of his own journey with his dog Charley, a poodle, across and around the country in the early 1960s. It's fabulous. It's wonderful. It's amazing. It's not shocking. It's not dramatic. It's peaceful. It's calm. But it is thought-provoking. And it kind of sneaks up on you. I mean, it starts off talking about his preparations, talking about the rig that he's camping in, talking about his interactions with his dog, talking about his interactions with other people in contexts of camping. But eventually he ends up dealing with the civil rights movement as he travels down south in the early 60s. And all of a sudden you're like into the middle of this real heavy thing. Now, I don't know much about Steinbeck's politics, and I'm not particularly interested in his politics. But the man could write as a writer. The man had a command of his pen, which really, I guess, shouldn't surprise me. If writing is opening a vein and bleeding, that's what Steinbeck does here. Again, not dramatic. It's like a cross between a travelogue, a journal, a look back, behind the scenes peek, all of these things of this great writer. And ever since that time, ever since I read that, I have aspired or dreamed about doing something similar. I actually still have this dream. What I want to do one day, God willing, is write my own travels with Charley, but focus specifically on small, rural, evangelical churches. I would love to get a camper and head out on a 3 to 6 month trip and pull into town and go to Sunday school at this local evangelical church and go there for worship, and then maybe on Monday morning do an interview with the pastor and either move on to someplace else for a Wednesday night meeting or stay there until Wednesday and then move on to the next place. We have so much, and this is, again, something Steinbeck showed us. Steinbeck showed us that real life, the real world, is not just the world in New York and Los Angeles and Washington. And the same thing is true in the evangelical church. It's not just the big steeples. And so I'd love to be able to see what I can gather, see what I can learn and discern about the nature of the church in America that is missed because we measure the church by the people who are famous. Well, that's an impact of a book on you, and it makes you want to go and do likewise. My encouragement for you is that you would pick up Travels with Charley. It may be now 60 years old, but it's still an outstanding read and still a very helpful picture into that day, but also into this world. Check it out. If you've already read it, let me know what you thought. If you read it going forward, let me know what you thought. Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.